Hello, my name is Valentina Izmirlieva, and I'm the director of Harriman Institute. It is my distinct pleasure on this very strange and grim day to welcome an old friend and a new one, Edward Tyerman, who is our former graduate student and former colleague from Barnard College. At the Slavic department, and Nikolai Folland, professor of Asian Studies and Comparative Literature from Penn State University. It is a special treat for us at Columbia to have Ed back, and not just for a talk, but to celebrate this wonderful book, his Internationalist Aesthetics, China and Early Soviet Culture. Edward Tyerman came to Columbia as a student in comparative literature, equally invested in Russian and Chinese studies. I still remember the day when he came to visit my class as a visiting prospective student years ago. And he studied with my former colleague and also predecessor at Harriman, Catherine Nepomniachtchi, who was one of his advisors, and with Lydia Liu, who advised him on the side of Chinese studies. A stellar student. Here, he immediately upon graduation was hired as a visiting professor at Barnard and upheld the Barnard Slavic for several years before he was hired at Berkeley, where I'm happy to say he just got tenure and was promoted to an associate professor. One of the few people, together with our other guest, Professor Folland, Edward focuses on Russia-Chinese cultural relations, and we are in for a treat because he will talk about his new book and about where he would like to take his studies from there on. The respondent to Ed's talk today, Professor Folland, works also on modern Chinese literature, cosmopolitanism, and transnational socialism, and is the author of Socialist Cosmopolitanism, the Chinese Literary Universe. So we look forward to an interesting conversation. The format is Ed will talk for a while, and then Nico will take over, make some responses, and then they will have a brief discussion between themselves, after which we will open the floor for a Q&A. And now, please welcome with me, Edward Tyerman.
Thank you so much, Valentina, and for that wonderful introduction. And it's a genuine pleasure for me also to make this virtual homecoming back to Columbia, and also the Harriman Institute, which I should say has supported this book really throughout its genesis and up to its publications. It's actually published as part of the studies in the Harriman Institute, so I'm really honored to have the chance to talk about it here today. It definitely feels like a strange day to be talking about the internationalist and anti-imperialist aspirations of a group of early Soviet artists at a moment when Russian armies are rolling into Ukraine. But maybe we can gain some kind of I don't know, optimism perhaps from these alternative histories that the book is interested in uncovering. So I'm gonna share my screen and just talk a little bit about about the book and what I try to do in the book. And then I'm really glad that Nico is here and has kindly offered his time to give some comments. So in the book, I offer what I think is, in a way, the first real systematic exploration of this profound engagement with China that takes place in early Soviet culture. And it's an engagement that was both political and, I suggest, closely bound up with questions of aesthetic form. So while the Soviet-controlled Comintern was working to forge an alliance in China in the 1920s between the nationalist and communist parties, Soviet writers, filmmakers, and other artists traveled to China, collaborated with Chinese students and intellectuals, and sought to refashion the relationship between the Soviet public and China. So my central claim in the book is that China became the key site for imagining, for early Soviet culture's attempts to imagine the possibilities of an internationalist aesthetics, by which I mean a mode of cultural production that could reshape political affinities across the borders of difference established by the era of imperialism. Now, of course, China was not the only space where Soviet internationalism projected its possibilities, though it was the closest the Comintern came to fostering an anti-imperial revolution in this period. But more importantly for my argument, China was also the space where this political question of internationalism consistently became an aesthetic question of form and mediation. Across the genres and media of the new Soviet society, from travel writing, fiction and biography to theater, ballet, documentary film, the question of how to represent the world for a Soviet audience was closely bound up with the question of how to represent that, how to connect that audience to China. So to illustrate the centrality of China for this larger project, I begin the book with a poem that is also an anecdote. On 23rd of March 1927, Vladimir Mayakovsky, perhaps the most famous poet of the Soviet revolutionary era, published a poem called The Best Verse, Лучший стих. This short text describes a reading held in the city of Yaroslavl just 2 days earlier. An audience member gives Mayakovsky a simple request: Comrade Mayakovsky, read your best poem. While the poet is pondering which of his poems to choose, the secretary of the local paper whispers a piece of news into his ear. Mayakovsky turns to the audience and, in place of a composition of his own, announces the news he has just heard. Comrades, workers, and Canton soldiers have taken Shanghai. And the poem reports the audience's response. As if crushing tin in their palms, the power of the ovation grew and grew. For 5, 10, 15 minutes, Yaroslavl applauded. Gathering power, this applause crosses Eurasia to participate in an uprising taking place on the Pacific, an uprising which Mayakovsky frames as a revolt against British imperial power. It seems this storm stretched across the Vyorsts in response to all of Chamberlain's notes, rolled to China, and the dreadnoughts turned their steel mugs away from Shanghai. So solidarity in Mayakovsky's imagination has material geopolitical effects. Applause in Yaroslavl has the power to intervene in events in China. The power of this applause, meanwhile, forces Mayakovsky to devalue his own life's work in poetry relative to the latest news from the front line of the global revolution. I will not equate all of that poetic slush, any of the greatest poetic glories. I will not equate them to the simple newspaper fact if Yaroslavl applauds it thus. So in line with what Elizabeth Papazian has called the documentary moment in early Soviet culture, Mayakovsky's verses here downgrade poetry to the subordinate role of celebrating the emotional power of the simple newspaper fact. Here, however, that fact explicitly affirms the possibilities of an internationalist political consciousness. The best verse celebrates the capacity of reported news, transmitted at high speed through the electrical medium of the telegraph, to produce a sense of connection to political struggles taking place on the other side of the continent. So discovering this poem, which was one of many that Mayakovsky wrote in the 1920s for newspapers on contemporary political developments, was one of the things that first piqued my curiosity that led me to write the book. Why, I wondered, is Mayakovsky's best poem a line of reported news about events in China? The event to which Mayakovsky is referring here was the arrival in Shanghai of the Northern Expedition. This was a military advance from Guangzhou in southern China by the army of the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party, which at that time was in a Comintern brokered alliance with China's recently formed Communist Party. This was an alliance that the Comintern had organized, operating on the theory which had been articulated first by Lenin, that the Communist International should support anti-imperial national revolutions in colonized and semi-colonized countries, the idea being that this would disrupt the economic power of the imperial countries. Shanghai at that time was the center of foreign capital's power in semi-colonial China. This army that marched north had been trained by Soviet advisors, led by Mikhail Baradin and Vasily Blyucher, who had been working with this nationalist communist alliance since 1924. China at this moment offered the Comintern and the Soviet Union their best hope for a successful anti-imperial revolution in Asia. It was a hope that was soon dashed. Less than a month after Mayakovsky published his poem, the nationalists turned on their communist allies in Shanghai, massacring hundreds and imprisoning hundreds more. Nonetheless, Mayakovsky choosing this event as the inspiration for his best poem speaks to the intense engagement with China in the Soviet Union of the 1920s, an engagement that spread beyond the pages of newspapers to enter into the dynamic search for new cultural forms that animated the first decade of Soviet history. Mayakovsky's poem is, in a sense, an expression of false modesty, right? Rather than actually rejecting poetry altogether, it really celebrates the ability of poetry to respond to and incorporate the power of this newspaper fact. Poetry here participates in a search for cultural forms adequate to an era shaped by the expanding reach of transnational media and by the pursuit of internationalist revolutionary politics. And this, in microcosm, is the task of what I call internationalist aesthetics, to adapt and innovate cultural forms to serve the purpose of repositioning distant China in the Soviet imagination as coeval and vitally connected. So the most important figure for this project, and the central figure in the book, is Sergei Tretyakov, pictured here in Beijing, a writer and theorist who played a key role in the early Soviet and indeed wider European avant-garde, alongside more famous colleagues and friends such as Mayakovsky, Eisenstein, Rodchenko, and Brecht. Tretyakov spent 18 months teaching Russian at Beijing University in 1924 and 1925, and became the foremost Soviet voice on China in this period. For Tretyakov, only a documentary approach grounded in direct contact with contemporary China could overturn the exotic fetishization of China in the Russian and European culture of the early 20th century. In the first lines of his programmatic essay, Loving China, Любить Китай, from 1925, Tretyakov offers an ironic summary of this false image of China that, according to him, dominates the popular imagination. And I'll read the English. A mysterious country, an inscrutable people. Chinese porcelain, Chinese shadows, Chinese silk, Chinese tea, the Chinese wall, Chinese writing, Chinese umbrellas. Ah, those refined Chinese torches, the Chinese princess Turandot, porcelain nodding dolls, Chinese fans, Chinese gowns, opium dens, groans in addition a sensitive laywoman attracted to the theatre and exotic books. This is the knowledge of China held by 90% of our average citizens. So here Tretyakov is presenting China as a social reality that's been mystified in some way by what we might call a regime of commodified exoticism. Beyond its primary impenetrability, China is experienced through its commodities, the famous exports such as porcelain, silk, and tea that proved so popular and so profitable in the European world. Now, of course, under the Marxist notion of commodity fetishism, which I think is what Tretyakov is gesturing towards here, the commodity form obscures the social nature of production precisely by disguising the social labor that produces the object. Through the mediation of exchange value, a social relationship between people becomes a reified relationship between things. And expanding this logic to the case of China, Tretyakov suggests here that a commodified China becomes not a human population coexisting alongside and interconnected with their Soviet contemporaries, but rather a set of objects to be purchased and consumed. This reification expands into the realm of the cultural imagination, where a sequence of fragmented synecdoches stand in for China: the theatre of shadows, the Great Wall, ideographic writing, parasols, fans, opium dens. These images of China circulate through a transnational cultural economy of exotic books and stage performances, whose center is Western Europe, and elsewhere Tretyakov directs particular ire at contemporary French writers like Pierre Loti, Claude Farrère, Gustave Mirbeau, purveyors of what Jonathan Spence has called the French exotic in their very popular writings on China from this period. So both Chinese commodities and images of China circulate through a global capitalist economy that reifies China as consumable exotica and mystifies its contemporary reality. Through this reification, the Chinese people themselves are effaced. Their true position in the global system is concealed. But Tretyakov's work on China stands at the beginning of his commitment to what would later in the decade become known as factography, or the literature of fact. And this is a form of writing that rejects fiction entirely and insists on the fixation of facts as the correct form for a post-revolutionary literature. And Tretyakov's factographic method, I suggest, actually begins as a method for overcoming the exoticization of a foreign space. This fetishized relationship the public currently has with China must be replaced by a sense of connection between human subjects experiencing commensurable forms of revolutionary change. And China in the 1920s was, not unlike its Soviet neighbor, a place of political transformation and cultural radicalism. The Republican Revolution of 1911 and 1912 had toppled the Qing dynasty, but failed to produce a stable new order, with warring military factions competing for control of the state. The intellectual debates of the New Culture movement in the 1910s and the May 4th movement in the 1920s had criticized Confucian tradition and opened themselves to a vast range of intellectual influences, taken from the West, from Japan, and indeed from Russia, all in the search for a viable form of modern Chinese culture. So Tretyakov's task is to convince his readers, as he puts it later in this same essay, that fantasy is more grey than reality. That is, the reality of China's tempestuous, revolutionary entry into modernity is more exciting and more worthy of engagement than the hallucinatory falsities of exoticism. Now, this work requires essentially an active disruption of these various acquired knowledges and stereotypes. An elegant example of this practice can be found on the cover of Zhongguo, which is Tretyakov's book of sketches about China, published in 1927. And this very elegant cover design is by Alexander Rodchenko, his close friend and colleague. Tretyakov's title is a Cyrillic transliteration of Zhongguo, which is literally central state or middle kingdom. It's the two characters on either side of the Cyrillic on the cover. This is a term of ancient origin that by the Republican period had become the standard name in Chinese for the Chinese state. By choosing Zhongguo for his title, Tretyakov is deliberately rejecting the Russian word for China, Kitai, which does not actually correspond to any name for China in Chinese. It actually comes from a group called the Khitan, who were a Mongol people that ruled Manchuria and parts of northern China from the 10th to the 12th dynasties. So Kitai, in this context, signifies the accumulated meanings that have accrued around China in the Russian cultural context. In other words, precisely this exotic commodification of Kitai as fans, silk, durandot, etc. So this rejection of Kitai expresses an ambition to convey China on its own terms, freed from these exotic distortions. Nonetheless, this first encounter with Zhongguo for most readers of Russian will likely cause a sense of confusion and estrangement. Close in some ways to the futurist poetic idea of transrational language, of Zaum, of a word that seems to have no immediate semantic associations and is experienced as pure sort of verbal material. Russian readers seeking traces of something familiar in this unfamiliar term might even grasp for the word chuzhoy, which means strange or alien, and actually shares 4 of its 5 letters with this rendering of Zhongguo. However, this strangeness will be overcome once the reader understands that Zhongguo transliterates a meaningful semantic unit in Chinese. And in Rodchenko's very striking cover design, this illegible Cyrillic term appears between the 2 characters in Chinese that render it and give it meaning, within an overall design and balance, with an overall design whose balance and sense of symmetry insists upon some sort of feeling of equivalence. So this avant-garde technique of estrangement works here as the first step It jolts the reader out of the frame of the familiar exotic. It dispels Kitai and its accumulated cultural baggage, and it insists instead that we're confronted with a term which is both truly foreign and can also be rendered in some way equivalent and meaningful. So this cover in some sense offers, I think, a microcosm for the larger project that Tretyakov undertakes in his own internationalist aesthetics. This assertion that the book will remove exotic distortion, will transmit China as it really is, while at the same time insisting on some possibility of asserting commensurability, comprehensibility, and indeed the translatability of China into terms that a Russian audience can understand. Now, one remarkable aspect of Tretyakov's work on China that really shapes the book is the sheer range of genres and media across which he worked. It's really a kind of search that is taking place in his work for a correct method for mediating this transformed relationship with China. His work on China includes poetry, reportage, photography, playwriting, cinema, and collaborative ethnography. So in seeking to understand the multimedia quality of this project, I draw in the book on the writing of Jacques Rancière, who defines aesthetics in his terms as a particular distribution of the sensible, by which he means an arrangement of forms that renders the social world perceptible and determines what can and cannot be presented to sense experience. So the internationalist aesthetics of Tretyakov and others at this time, I suggest, sought what we might call a redistribution of the sensible. That is, a reordering of what can be seen, heard, and felt that might enable expanded forms of political association to take place. This project necessitated an engagement with a range of media forms, all of which offered different ways of appealing to the human sensorium and producing this sense of connection with China, and all of which were being actively contested in the 1920s, while there's a search underway for the correct mode for a revolutionary culture to find its expression. So in each chapter of the book, I juxtapose Tretyakov's work on a particular medium or genre to the work of his contemporaries, not all of whom shared his ideological or methodological suppositions. Internationalist aesthetics in this regard represents not so much a method as a contested search, I would say, for a method. So in the first chapter, I read Tretyakov's poems and sketches about China. These are some of his photographs and images from his sketches, which appeal to sight and sound above all, in order to try and predict a successful and indeed recognizable process of revolutionary transformation. Alongside Tretyakov's work, the travel writing of Boris Pilniak offers an audiovisual experience of China that is much more radically unstable, veering wildly between identification and alienation, and haunted by a sense of revolutionary modernity as disruption and homelessness. During his time in Shanghai, Pilniak collaborated on an ultimately unfinished film production with two prominent Chinese leftist intellectuals, Tian Han and Jiang Guangci. And their encounter illustrates the intense engagement with Russian literature and Russian revolutionary experience among China's intellectuals in the 1920s, but also the divergent understandings of the relationship that limited their capacity to collaborate. The second chapter on theatre juxtaposes two high-profile theatrical productions from the 20s that placed contemporary China on the Soviet stage. Tretyakov's documentary play Raw China restaged a recent instance of British imperialist violence in Sichuan, while The Red Poppy, a ballet about a love affair between a Chinese dancer and a Soviet naval captain, offered a kind of Sovietized Orientalism, but became enormously popular and indeed was canonized as the first successful Soviet ballet. In chapter 3, I focus on cinema, where I reconstruct Tretyakov's enormously ambitious but sadly unrealized project for a trilogy of films to be set and shot in contemporary China. This was also going to be titled Zhongguo and was also going to be directed by Sergei Eisenstein. Sadly, these films weren't made, but I juxtaposed Tretyakov's plans against two documentary films that were made. One is The Great Flight from 1925, which is one of the first Soviet expedition films and records the journey of an aviation expedition from Moscow across Siberia, Mongolia to Beijing, and later and down to Shanghai. And the second is Shanghai Document, which is a kind of city symphony that offers a remarkable application of early Soviet montage theory to China's most important semi-colonial city. Then in the final chapter, I consider what I think is Tretyakov's most innovative experiment in internationalist aesthetics. After his return to Moscow, he worked with one of his students from Beijing, an aspiring writer named Gao Returns, to produce a collaborative account of Gao's life. This experiment and co-authorship, which Tretyakov called a bio-interview, appeared in print under the pseudonym Deng Shihua and offered Soviet readers an extensive account of contemporary Chinese society, as seen from the perspective of a young person's life. So the last thing I want to say as part of this kind of summary of the book, one of the really remarkable things about Tretyakov's work alongside this kind of multimedia aspect, for me, is the series of meta-reflections on his own role and his own authority as a mediator of China that he places at the center of his work. This question of authority, I think, was really central to the wider project of socialist internationalism. The Comintern, which was founded by the Bolsheviks in 1919, explicitly set itself the task of expanding the scope of world revolution beyond Europe and North America to encompass the anti-imperial struggles of the colonized world. So this expansion of the revolutionary project held out some kind of possibility of decentering Europe and providing a framework for European and Asian communists to fight together. At the same time, however, the activities of the Comintern became increasingly subordinated to Soviet control, which led to a prioritizing of Soviet theory, Soviet experience, and the strategic interests of the Soviet state. And Tretyakov's writings on China placed this tension between egalitarian solidarity and hierarchical leadership at their very core. Tretyakov constantly reflects on the nature of his own role as a Soviet mediator of China, flagging up his limitations as an outsider with limited knowledge of Chinese, even as he asserts his privileged capacity to interpret China's revolutionary reality as a Soviet observer with experience of the Russian Revolution and its progression. So his claims to analytical insight or artistic veracity are constantly being destabilized and undercut by reminders of his own dependence on Chinese mediators and imperfect processes of translation. And these meta-reflections reach a kind of apotheosis in the bio-interview Deng Shihua, produced from a series of interviews between Tretyakov and his former student Gao over a period of 6 months. And this is a photograph of Gao Shihua from Tretyakov's archive, which is in itself a fascinating image, which I'd be happy to talk about some more. This 300+ page book about Gao's life does not end with revolutionary triumph, but rather with confusion and uncertainty. Gao returns to China after the Shanghai massacre of April 1927. Tretyakov loses touch with him, and another student suggests that much of what Gao told his former teacher may have been lies. Now, Tretyakov's book coincided with the defeat of Soviet policy in China. As I mentioned, the Chinese nationalists turned on their allies in 1927 and drove Soviet advisors out of the country. But in this book, Tretyakov turns defeat into a new method, insisting that a mode of aesthetic production that seeks to be truly internationalist must also be one that questions its own grounds of authority, the limits of its knowledge, and its right to represent the other. Okay, I'll leave it there. I'm really looking forward to hearing what Nico has to say. So thanks everyone for listening.
Great. Well, thanks, Valentina, and thanks to the Harriman Institute for inviting me. This is a great event on the wrong day, but it's such a pleasure to help discuss Ed's book here. Curiously, there seems to be a real tide of recent interest in Eurasian connection. There's, of course, Edward's book. There is the volume Internationalist Aesthetics by Amelia Glasser and Stephen Lee. And there is also recently this volume, Carolina Clark's. So we have a good panel of recent attempts to rethink the literary relations of the early Soviet Union, of Soviet Russia, and the surrounding areas, especially to the south and to the east of it. What these studies, what these approaches are forcing us to do is to think Russian and Soviet literature in a global context, especially asking how does such a view change our understanding of Russian literature? what then are the repercussions of these literary developments within the Soviet Union for the areas beyond the Soviet Union's borders, and for our understanding of, for the understanding of literature in these places. And finally, I believe that they challenge us, these insights challenge us to force us to rethink world literature and world literary studies itself and the dynamics that underlie world literary studies. I'll try to address some of these topics. I can't go into detail in all of them in the few minutes here. Let me begin with the question of China in the Russian imagination. So you might not be aware, but I'm aware that there has been a slight change in the subtitle of Ed Tyerman's book. That was originally, the subtitle was Imagining China in Early Soviet Culture, and now it is China and Early Soviet Culture. This is a subtle change, but quite a significant one. And I'm glad that this change has happened, because China and early Soviet culture obviously upgrades the question of China. On the other hand, it tones down the imagining and the reimagining, and the consideration that we are dealing with here, not as a factual China, but also as an image of China and the uses of this image of China. And I think this is very important to keep in mind when we read Tretyakov and the debates that his work here is has launched. The book arguably works through this latter understanding, the question of imagining China, that seems to be very important here. So Tretyakov and others, they spend times in China, but their works, they are targeted at a domestic audience, and they are important for what they project. In other words, precisely, ended on that, on the processes of mediation. They draw attention to the processes of mediation that are not easy, that are complicated, because this is often a multi-step mediation that is involved here. So the representation of China, or China in inverted commas here, is a central question. And in that respect, the book joins a good and long list of other works that have tackled the problem of imagining China as a place, and also as a space to project their own images and ideas and wishes and hopes. That begins, of course, with Said's Orientalism. Said obviously focuses mostly on the Near East rather than the Far East, but the conjectures that Said has made have been widely read all the way, pushed all the way to Japan, including China here. Which is somewhat unfortunate because of the very categorical and nature of Said's work that forces us into certain kinds of certain forms of thinking, and that Edward's book is clearly a challenge to drawing to different and significantly more complex viewpoints. But take other examples. Take Ezra Pound. Ezra Pound's fascination with Japanese and Chinese poetry, not as an end in itself, but as an opening that allows Pound to reinvent, rethink the possibilities of literature, and thus makes China as a cipher a very central idea in the launching of modernism. Of course, Pound is a contemporary of Tretyakov. So while we have these thought experiments and these departures happening in Moscow. In other places, China is used in surprisingly similar ways. How can we compare these? And can we compare these? Are there even influences there? Are there contrasts? For me, this question raises precisely, well, what is Soviet about these Soviet images in China? How generally are they shared worldwide? And the internationalist part here in the title, the internationalism, if we understand in the socialist and the communist sense of the term, what is this internationalist sense of imagining China? How do you imagine China in an internationalist as opposed to a non-internationalist, not internationalist sense? Allow me another example, Bertolt Brecht, The Good Person of Sichuan, and quite a few other works. So The Good Person of Sichuan was written 1938, 1941, during Brecht's exile from Nazi Germany. At a time when Brecht was making frequent visits to Moscow. It was in Moscow in 1935 that Brecht visited the performances by the Peking opera star Mei Lanfang that Brecht quoted as a major influence on his own work in his developing of alienation effect here. So if we consider that at the very time when the developments that Edward is laying out here in front of us, Moscow itself was a cosmopolitan hub that rivaled both Paris and Berlin. A fourth Rome, as Katharina Clark has put it. This cosmopolitan milieu, how does that figure into the Russian making of China, of these images? Are there other vectors of influence? Are there other vectors of mediation? Are there circulatory trajectories here? These are all questions that seem to be most intriguing to further perform here. What does that tell us about the globalization of images of China, about China abroad? So if Brecht's German leftist image of China was shaped in Tretyakov's Moscow, what are the circuits of the interwar cultural imagination and the multiplicity of diversity of views of China in a global marketplace of ideas? Forgive me the neoliberal platitude here. But I'm especially interested in or intrigued by these multi-vectoral or these polycentric views, and what do they do to help us to speak back to this homogenizing model that Said has into place here, and that has been so influential. Just a final point before I'm ending here. I know I'm throwing some very big questions out here. The book, Edward's book, focuses very wisely on early Soviet culture in his book title. But what happens to this project over time? Personally, I'm particularly interested in the 1950s, in the heyday of the Sino-Soviet cooperation. The founding of the People's Republic of 1949 was a watershed in establishing a second communist nation of continental reach. Now, how did this development alter the Soviet imaginations or images of China? Hint here, there's room for a follow-up study, and I'll leave it open if this debate will be taken up by Ed or by an enterprising graduate student looking for a Bomber dissertation topic. But I'm super glad that Ed has written this book and that he's written it the way he has. I've learned so much from it, and I'm looking forward to learning more from him and from you in the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nico, for those wonderful and rich comments, which, I mean, give me so much to say and to think about. Maybe shall I say a few words in response, or before we take questions? I mean,
That sounds good.
I think it's really helpful the way that you've tried to place the book within this larger global context, both in terms of a kind of a longer global history of China as an image, right, as a kind of signifier, particularly in what we might sort of broadly and loosely call the cultures of the West, and which is obviously related to things like Said's Orientalism, but I think also takes on its own distinctive features in the Chinese case that are quite different to the kind of Middle East Islamic world that Said focuses on. I would say, so first of all, the question about image, taking out the word imagining, partly I wanted a snappier title, but actually I always kind of struggled with that term because I think what Tretyakov is trying to get beyond, or claiming he's trying to get beyond, is precisely the image, right? And the idea that the image is some kind of sort of aesthetic barrier between the consumer and some kind of foreign reality. So this emphasis on documentary methods, on sort of accentuating his own presence in China, trying to use, for example, he uses poetry to try and capture phonetically the sounds of street traders in Beijing, the emphasis on cinema that is documentary in nature, right, that is trying to capture actual kind of traces of experienced Chinese reality. All of these, the emphasis on this documentary element, which is the major difference, I would say, to other modernist engagements with China, in people like Pound and even Brecht, is all geared towards trying to emphasize China is a contemporary reality, right, that is happening in exactly the same time as we are happening. And I think it's that attempt to try and overcome notions of China as primarily a kind of ancient civilization whose exotic difference can cause a sort of aesthetic renewal, right? Which is how I think someone like Pound relates to China. It's that idea of China's kind of difference and the alterity of the Chinese poetic system that can renew Anglo-American modernism, right? For Tretyakov, it's really about emphasizing that this is the aesthetic renewal comes from emphasizing this is a kind of contemporary reality which we can affirm some kind of material connection to. And so there, I think the emphasis on the documentary is what's really striking about the Soviet approach to China, right? And is linked to this kind of interest that happens in the 1920s in documentary methods as a way of really knowing the world in a more kind of valid and totalizing fashion than fiction or other forms of aesthetic experience can bring. At the same time, you're absolutely right that this doesn't mean that this is reality transmitted without shaping, right? There is, of course, there's an image in the sense that Tretyakov always has a framework that he's imposing on China. So by affirming China's contemporaneity, he's also basically constantly trying to read China in terms of recognizable Soviet frameworks for understanding how revolutions operate, right? Which is broadly a kind of extension of the Russian experience to these colonized and semi-colonized spaces. A lot of it's to do with the ideas of what later gets called uneven and combined development, right? So there are certain conditions within less developed countries that can actually lead to a revolutionary dynamic. And this happened in Russia, so maybe it's also happening in some sense in China. So the idea of the internationalist element here, I think, is precisely in sort of asserting this kind of coexistence in the present, right? It's getting over what, in kind of post-colonial studies gets called the denial of coevalness. How shared worldwide these things were is a really interesting question. And actually in the theatre chapter, I go into this in more detail because the careers of these two productions are strikingly opposed. Raw China was actually a very successful international production that was staged all over the world. It was staged in Germany and in the UK, in New York, but also it was staged in Japan and then translated from Japanese into Chinese and staged several times in China in the 1930s and actually staged in 1949 at the founding of the Chinese People's Republic of China. That was, I think, the last staging of Raw China in China happened in Beijing in 1949. And it influenced things like there's a famous woodcut by the artist Li Hua called Nuhou Ba Zhongguo, which is clearly drawing on Tretyakov's phrase. So there you have an example of the way that this Soviet internationalist aesthetics could travel, And in the book, I try to argue that it's actually the way Tretyakov deals with translation and acknowledges that the play is an imperfect translation of a foreign reality that allows it to become translatable and to move through different global spaces. On the other hand, the ballet The Red Poppy, which was very, very popular within the Soviet Union, was not only not staged in China, but was actively offensive to Chinese audiences when they saw it, because they watched it and thought, hey, this is this kind of exoticization and of China, but also this image of the red poppy as an image of revolutionary solidarity doesn't work for us because it represents opium and the opium wars and imperialist oppression. So that's an example of how actually Soviet aesthetics was concerned with its own system of signs and actually found it quite difficult to look outside. I mean, I have a lot of other things to say, but maybe I should leave some time for questions. I guess the 1950s is something that I'm actively thinking about some more and have started working on a little bit. I think there the big difference is that this kind of avant-garde dynamic that you see with people like Tretyakov is really gone. It's kind of evacuated by the 50s, right? When actually the dynamic is really, China itself is invested in absorbing, as you've written about yourself, certain aspects of kind of Soviet Stalinist culture, socialist realist novels, Soviet cinema, right? And a lot of the collaborations that are happening at that point are engaged in this kind of cultural transfer between China and the Soviet Union, although that comes with its own tensions and anxieties about who is exactly, what this sort of junior partner, senior partner dynamic really means. So that's something I'm also really interested in exploring a little bit more over the next few years.
I just want to remind you that we have about 10 minutes left from our allotted time. So if we want to give the floor to our audience for brief questions and answers, it would be great.
There is, in fact, a question in the Q&A. I can read that. It's from Benjamin Kindler from your alma mater, I believe, Edward. Benjamin writes, perhaps Edwards or both speakers might say a little about how they understand the terms internationalism, cosmopolitanism in relation to each other, appearing as they do in their respective works. Seems to me that cosmopolitanism signifies in a way that is politically very different to internationalism. Do you want to give that a shot?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the things I do try to emphasize in the book is that when I talk about socialist internationalism, I'm not necessarily saying that all of the people that I discuss were kind of signed up in every way to, or even fully kind of aware of all the political programs of the Comintern and its sort of, statutes for how revolutions should be organized across the world. I'm really more interested in this idea that this kind of larger political frame of the project of supporting revolutions in other countries, and that relying on a sense of solidarity with foreign populations who often have been previously been coded as alien. I'm interested in the kind of horizons that opened up for artists and writers who are working at this time. And a lot of them responded to it in very different ways. So Tretyakov, I think, adheres quite closely to the larger Comintern project of we need to find some way of creating a sort of bond between these populations if this political project is going to work. For others like Pilniak, for example, it's a much more unstable relationship where actually the kind of possibility of the international to destabilize the national becomes something that he's a lot more anxious and wary of. And I would say on the Chinese side, when you look at some of the people that these Soviet agents were interacting with, like Tian Han, Jiang Guangci, Tretyakov's students, often this kind of international dimension of revolution was still somewhat subordinated to the urgency of the national question of national sovereignty and kind of creating a viable Chinese national state in this period. So the Soviet influence is seen as something that can offer some sort of guidelines for that, but is not necessarily the prime goal is international revolution from the Chinese side. So really, I think it's a field in which there are shifting understandings of exactly what internationalism means. And that's one of the things that I think creates both often kind of miscommunication, but also this kind of creative dynamism. Nico, did you want to say anything about cosmopolitanism? Since it's your turn.
Very briefly, because we have two other questions in the Q&A. So I regard internationalism as essentially a political activist project, whereas cosmopolitanism for me is a mindset, and it's much more anchored in the cultural scene and as an individual sentiment and as a self-positioning. Now, to nicely pry the two apart in this way works only theoretically, because I think as both the examples in Edward's book and those that I've been discussing in my book, and especially those that Katarina Clark has excavated for 1930s Moscow, have shown these two are intertwined and interrelated. In other words, cosmopolitan sentiment, cosmopolitan ambitions often make use of internationalist ideas and internationalist frameworks to perpetuate each other. The cosmopolitan one is clearly the older impulse that predates the revolution, but it doesn't stop, it doesn't get shut down at the moment of the revolution, but it gets reinvented and it gets repurposed. So I see a lot of continuities here. I see a lot of mutual inspiration here, but I want to really keep it at that. Shall I read the next question from the Q&A? This is from Ronald Meyer, who asks if Edward could say more. Some more things about the translation aspects. He knows of various translations of Wang Wei that are adding exotic elements to make it more Chinese. So the forest is suddenly jade green, and so on. So he speaks about translations from English here. I think the idea is here, how does that look? If we look at this from this perspective at Tretyakov's and other Russian texts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's also a great question. So the translation of modern Chinese literature, of writers like Lu Xun, Mao Dun, Ding Ling, and others who are writing in the 20s and 30s and trying to create a new kind of Chinese realism, often explicitly thinking about Soviet and Russian writing as they're doing it. That's something that really takes off in the late 1920s and kind of expands in the 30s. And I have a piece coming out about this in a volume about Soviet world literature pretty soon. One of the things that's interesting there is actually it's not so much adding exotic elements as removing modernist elements. So by the 1930s, when there's a kind of socialist realist consensus has much more firmly taken shape, when they're translating people like Lu Xun, for example, his early stories, which are heavily influenced by Russian modernists like Leonid Andreev, they're taking out all of the kind of more strange, modernist, elaborate metaphors and kind of complex ambiguities. They're trying to smooth out these texts to make them more recognizably part of a kind of global canon of socialist realism. In terms of what I talk about in the book, in Tretyakov's work in particular, the question of translation is very vexed. I mean, Tretyakov himself had, I think, a sort of smattering of conversational Chinese, but was not someone who was able to, read and translate Chinese text. When he speaks with his student to make this bio interview, it seems they spoke in Russian, and he describes even his students sometimes kind of sketching and drawing things because his Russian wasn't always good enough to describe what they're talking about. So what Tretyakov does, which is again what I find really interesting about him, is he really emphasizes that the processes of translation have occurred and the ways in which that may have resulted in these kind of distortions and transformations in meaning in the processes of mediation. So this is one of the ways in which, while he is constantly invested in imposing his own kind of frame on understanding China, he also emphasizes that everything he does has been made from a particular kind of encounter, and thus that his own role in shaping it has fundamentally influenced the way that it is received by its reader, right? And that's one of the ways I think that his documentary method is working against some kind of totalizing reduction of China to a Soviet image, because it's constantly emphasizing this is the Soviet-made version of China, and there is a reality behind it, which is more complex and which has been translated and in some senses necessarily domesticated.
Great. I see we're ending our time. So let me just we have one more question here that brings us to the photographs. Quickly intersecting here, I love the photo, or was puzzled by the photograph of the Tretyakov book Zhongguo that has nice Chinese characters on the title, but then two rising red suns.
Oh, yeah.
Symbol for Japanese nationalism. Ouch! His Chinese readers would have cringed at that title. That's what gets lost in translation here. But to come back to the question here by Alexander Boskovich, thank you for such a nice event and congratulations on your book, Edward. Could you say a few words about the photograph of Tretyakov's student at the end of your presentation? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is an image that I found in Tretyakov's archive. It's not in the book. I think it was, clearly it seems like it was intended to be in the book, but was left out, which I suspect maybe because he changed the name of the student, because when he went back to China, there was possibility that because he'd been in Moscow, he would be repressed by the nationalists who were shooting communists at that time. And it's a sort of, it's a sort of photo collage, I would say, that really includes three photographs within a single image. The photograph in the top left of this young Chinese child reappears in one of Tretyakov's other books separately, in a chapter on fathers and sons. And the photo at the bottom right, I haven't seen anywhere else. But the photo in the middle is described within the book as this is the moment where he's in Beijing and the photograph is taken. So I think my sense is that this was intended to be a kind of visual image of the kind of bio-progression of the book itself, right? From boy through teenager to man. What I do with it in the book is I point out that it serves as a kind of a sort of symbol for what the book itself is trying to do in terms of questioning its own process of production. So this goes back to what I said a moment ago, that while this gestures, appeals to the fact that photography gives the sense of immediacy and the recording of a documented reality, right? At the same time, it's clearly a composed photograph that has been made by the processes of combining three separate images into one. And that's very much the impression that I argue Tretyakov wants his own book to give. That while this is an account of this person's life, it's not simply that life transparently rendered, right? It is an account that was produced from this complex process of discussion, conversation, collaboration. It's actually impossible to figure out which aspects of the book were written by Tretyakov, which bits were written by Gao. There's all sorts of moments in the book where they talk about translation and how these terms should be translated, which suggests a kind of co-authorship of the translation process of the book itself. And so it's an image, I think, that really captures this idea of both trying to convey China as immediate and sort of recorded, imprinted, rather than an image, and also insisting on the fact that that process is mediated and constructed and produces its own distortions. I hope that makes sense.
Allow me to follow up on that. I too find the photograph totally intriguing because the main photograph here is a highly stylized studio portrait. You see a painted background in the painted background, and you see this kind of chinoiserie like table or what it is with a strategically placed plant here. And the pose frontal in the camera with a side lighting that comes from behind, from over the shoulder of the photographer, and this silk jacket and what seems to be a gown in a rather traditional gentleman-like outfit here, not what we expect from a revolutionary. It's a very peculiar picture. There are people who know more than I do about studio photography in that era, and if that's of interest, I can probably put you in touch with them. But I find it a totally intriguing and puzzling picture for that particular purpose.
Yeah, absolutely. And he describes this process of going to the Beijing photograph studio in the book and having his photograph taken. So I think it is, something which is very deliberately staged. And, the largest trajectory of the book itself is really about Gao Shihua, who comes from a scholarly family in Sichuan, coming to Beijing, studying at Beijing University, and gradually undergoing this process of becoming increasingly attracted to Marxism and radical politics from working with people like Tretyakov. So that's really his kind of trajectory through the book is presented as a kind of from tradition to revolutionary modernity. And I'm pretty sure actually the photo at the bottom right was taken by Tretyakov himself and is of Gao when he was in Moscow, because Tretyakov took a lot of photographs, including in China, and they're scattered through the book. But then that whole progression is ruptured at the end when he goes back to China and this other student says, well, actually, Gao was never really a revolutionary. He was always more interested in dancing. He really just wanted to be a writer. He wasn't the revolutionary cause. And so the whole kind of structure of this quite teleological and classically Soviet journey from sort of tradition through to revolutionary consciousness is radically ruptured at the end of the book. And that's one of the things I think is so interesting about what Tretyakov does in that book.
From internationalism back to cosmopolitanism.
Maybe, right, maybe. It's an alternative title.
I'm really sorry to break this fascinating discussion, and it made me want to invite you back, hopefully in better times, both in terms of COVID and politics, and have you for a live audience here to continue the conversation, maybe bring it even to contemporary relations between Russia and China. So something to look forward to. Thank you both very much. Congratulations, Ed, for this book and for bringing us joy on a dark day. And I look forward to seeing you both at Harriman soon. Thank you all for tuning in with us, and see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much, Valentina. Bye-bye.
Bye.
All right. See you, Edward.
Bye. Thank you, Nico. Thanks for your comments. That was great.